Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Today I'm going to talk about a book called The Cause of All Nations by Don H. Doyle. Now, excuse me if I'm a little, what's the word? Discombobulated with my setup. I got a new monitor at the end of last year, so the way my webcam's set up might be a little disconcerting, but bear with me. Anyways, so what is this book about? When people think about the Civil War, depending on where you are, if you are an American, it is very common for you to consider this from a very domestic dispute between the Union and the Confederacy. A lot of people who become historians, or even the layperson, will reference Ken Burns' Civil War series in the 1990s, which was based off work by Shelby Foote. Shelby Foote, of course, that should be noted, has a bit of a Confederate bent towards his historiography and history, but that's, like I said, So for most people, the Civil War is a domestic situation. But for other countries, this is not a case. And this book takes the premise, and also work by Patrick Kelly, that involves studying the world response, particularly in Europe and in the Americas, and even Mexico, Canada too, to a lesser extent. But how they responded to the different events of what was going on with the South and the North over the issue of slavery and other such issues such as tariffs, cotton production, so on. Okay, the primary element of this is slavery. Some will disagree, but we're going off that premise for this book. Okay, so Don H. Doyle, he is a retired professor at the University of South Carolina. He has taught at other universities as well in Italy, and I believe Italy and France, Toulouse, I believe. And so his book was the idea, well, we're not recognizing in the United States that the Civil War was much more than a domestic dispute. So in the first chapter, and I think this is a very good attention-grabbing thing, and I'll show you really quick. Okay, key terms. All right. So we start with this. It's called, let me try to center it, Garibaldi's Question. Now, for anybody in Western Europe in particular, it's widely acknowledged that Giuseppe Garibaldi was a very important figure in the 19th century. But this book claims, based off of the evidence provided, that Garibaldi had been a major player within the discourse of how Europe responded to the United States Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. And so the book claims, based off of evidence and correspondence, that the Union and the South were facing this diplomatic conflict in Europe. And I mean, this makes sense, right? You have one of the most powerful nations in the Western Hemisphere at this time, and continuously rising, I should add, that, what happens there is important. And it's saying, based off of the events of the 1848 revolutions and previously, there had been a marked call for change. Change in the form of Republican government. Now, Republican government for this point is a promise of a more equitable system that is, people have a say in their way their government operates. For American viewers, the world, especially the developed world at this time, was monarchies. Monarchies were a major component. It would continue to be until at least the First World War, and probably even after, depending on, circumstances. But generally, the First World War is really the decline of that. for many reasons, but the Second World War, by the end of that war, I mean, we've pretty much, monarchy is gone. I mean, there's a couple places that have monarchy, but really there's only a few, like the United Kingdom, that really maintain a sort of powerful monarchy. Okay, a lot of these monarchs are figureheads. They have a constitution. They're restricted. I'm talking about monarchies in the sense of how they're portrayed as the autocratic people. They choose on a whim, policy, that kind of thing, okay? And so some of the major players in this book and at the time period was Napoleon III, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And he had taken power in France. Basically, there had been many issues. There was the July monarchy. I believe it was, Charles X? Something like that. There were individuals who, as dictated by people such as Victor Hugo, Stendhal, and others, there had been a conflict between the republicanism and the Bourbon dynasty, which had been, based off of the Capetans and so forth. A long history, but basically, Napoleon III, he's a monarchist. He comes to power. He uses his uncle's name, and he is very at home with the Confederates for a long time. And so this book will delve into that. And that's basically because Napoleon III is not he doesn't believe in equality for people. He believes in authority, hierarchy. Now, one distinguishing element of his regime versus his uncle's is that Napoleon Bonaparte actually changed legal systems with the Napoleonic codes. Napoleon III, he kind of, his legacy lasts, but like not in a good way. There's a war, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, I believe, and it basically sets up the First World War in a lot of ways, but that loss of Alsace in eastern France really is a sticking point. There are photographs of children being taught that this province is part of France and needs to be fought back. There's a lot of issues. You have Otto von Bismarck. He's doing his rise. He eventually leaves office, but he's about blood and iron. I mean, fundamentally, that is what he's about. When Wilhelm II comes about, he is essentially the same, but not as competent. To throw some shade, but it's true. I mean, he's been analyzed in multiple cases, but there has been a lot of evidence to show that the Germans were, they were building up, but there's a lot of personalities, and eventually these personalities would cause the demise of the German monarchy, but that's besides the point. And the Habsburgs, by the way, but I don't want to get too much on a tangent. This background information is important. So you have the French, Napoleon III, rich people gathering, not a lot of voting of the normal people in France. So it's not very, it's different than Louis XVI, but it's very similar, okay? Now, in the United Kingdom, you have Queen Victoria. She's fairly young at this point. She'd probably be, I think she was coronated in the 1850s, 1853, something like that. She's still very young. She hates republicanism. And in fact, I believe it's her husband or brother, one of those individuals who actually likes the U.S. and helps, advocate for the Union. But, if she had her way, they would be neutral or anti-union, okay? So you have these situations, and so you have a group of diplomats, which this book talks about, and they are tasked to win over these countries, these two major powers. There's other powers involved as well, including the Russians, Germans, but they're not as important for these early years of the Civil War. And in particular, we're looking at 1861, 1862, 1863. Those are the focus of this book. Okay, so And I have some notes here just so I can kind of delve in. I don't want to give the whole book away, obviously, so I'm going to mince my words a little bit, but yes. So, yeah. So with Garibaldi, he, he's trying to take over Italy, okay? He's trying to liberate Italy from Pope Pius the Ninth, who is seen as very tyrannical by some individuals. And so he is making a move. Eventually, he's going to make multiple moves on Rome and so forth. He eventually unites the country, he and other folks. But essentially, the Union, some individuals, which this guy has a funny name. His name is James W. Quiggle. And he wrote to Garibaldi, and he was not really supposed to, but he was under a guy named Sanford, and Sanford was kind of timid because at this point in the Civil War, Lincoln and his cabinet had not really acknowledged that the war was about liberating slaves. They were like, oh, well, we're trying to save the Union. Well, that didn't really fly very well with things. But yeah, so based off of James W. Quiggle's work, consulting with Garibaldi, trying to say, oh, we'll give you a generalship if you come over here. And so they go back and forth, and supposedly this idea also came about from Candido Vici, Garibaldi's secretary, who also liked this idea. Because Garibaldi's starting to get older at this point. He's done a lot of war over the years, but he still feels like he's got to fight. He hates slavery. So that's very important. All right. So, next thing is, while this is going on, this event, there are people in Europe who are advocating for emancipation, freedom of people, republicanism. And one of the interesting characters to point out at this time was Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. So, Jefferson Davis, who supposedly, according to this book and other accounts, he did not want to be the head of the Confederacy, but there really wasn't, he's kind of put into it, as some scholars used to claim that Robert E. Lee was kind of pushed into it. But, yeah, so Jefferson Davis, he's not really the firebrand as much. He's very skeptical of the situation, according to sources. Whereas Stephens, he's very open. He does not like the African Americans. He wants to enslave them, and he wants to continue this. One of his famous speeches in his inauguration, and later his cornerstone speech. And this basically lays out, yes, this war is about slavery. Pure and simple. And we want to continue this facet because this is what the natural way of what God would want. Basically, that's the sum and summation of Stephens' speech. So this is going on, and the people who are paying attention to Europe are like, yep, well, that just kind of reaffirms what we're thinking. And so a lot of the, what we call liberals, the people who are anti-monarchy, that is, they say, well, we're going to have, we got to do something about this. And there's a lot of different characters that this book goes about, but I'm going to talk about a few. So, one of these characters, this is skipping a little bit of ahead, but Karl Marx actually supported the Union during the Civil War, which is a bit surprising considering what Karl Marx and his colleague, I guess you could say his partner, Engels, had to say about this. So, in their mind, because of the failures of 1848, which they were part of, they run the Zeitung, a newspaper about such events, and they had ended up in the United Kingdom at this time, I believe. They actually supported the Union and translated documents into German and so forth in order to enlighten the public and support the public in Europe. The Union public, the Union. And based off of this, there is also evidence because Marx actually worked, I think it was the New York Daily Tribune, I believe it was. Yeah, that's what it is. Tribune, I think it was. And so he was a foreign correspondent, and he was just gathering information and so forth. He actually supported the Union because, in his mind, that the Confederates were essentially monarchists, and they were no different than, the bourgeoisie and all that. So even though the industrialists in the North are not great, their cause was very revolutionary in this case, the fight against slavery, that we should acknowledge that, put our differences aside to support them. So, I'm no fan of Marx, but in this case, it seems like he had the right ideas, at least. So, that's one individual. There are other individuals who I've written their names down because I don't want to botch them or forget them because they're important contributions. So let's see. Okay. So let's see. Yes. Karl Schurz, who he was a German immigrant, left after 1848. He eventually works his way up into government, and Lincoln is a friend of his. He is for emancipation, but Secretary Seward, at the time, Secretary of State Seward, which, by the way, he owned slaves, so this is kind of a conflict of interest here. Seward was he felt like he should have been president of the United States, fundamentally. And so he believed, well, I know what I'm doing. Lincoln does not know what he's doing, but he's president, so we're going to tell him what to do. And for a lot of the points, Lincoln takes his word because he's an elder statesman. He's got things going on. But like I said, he has this bias. His family owned slaves. There's issues, okay, with Seward. And he will have other issues with parts of Lincoln's cabinet later, especially his Secretary of War and so forth, but that's a different topic. And so, individuals like Schultz, Karl Schultz, they know the lingo of the Europeans. They can deal in their diplomatic circles. Now, unfortunately, Schurz, I believe, ends up as the Minister of Spain or Italy. Let me see what it was. It was, yes. Yeah, he wanted to be appointed to Italy, so he ended up in Spain because Seward kind of blocked him. But, yeah, there was other individuals. Let's see. Yeah, very fascinating. There was an African-American German person named Ottilie Essing, and she actually apparently was, and I'd never heard of this person, to be perfectly frank. She apparently was a sort of, she was a correspondent and intimate friend of Frederick Douglass, and she helped translate stuff from German and vice versa, back and forth. Based off of what the book says, and you can take it for what it is. Apparently, they had an independent relationship, like I mentioned. Frederick Douglass apparently gets remarried later on, and she commits suicide because of she's dying of terminal illness. But in her brief interlude, that her contribution to German and English correspondence was very major, so I thought I'd bring that up because like I said, I'd never heard of her before reading this book, so I thought that was very interesting. It's kind of like with a lot of these figures, they have these remarkable stories, but there's always skeletons in the closet. That is just part of history, But yeah, interesting lady. Let's see who else. Correspondence. Yep. Yeah, you had William Howard Russell. He was another individual. I believe he got sacked. He was in the London Sunday Times, I think it was. Yeah, he was sacked because of different reasons, and I think after that, they became much more hostile towards the Union, the British paper. So it was very delicate, some of these boundaries that had to be matched, but yeah. So let's see. For the background of America, a lot of European intellectuals had read Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and it kind of made commentary about the United States, about the people and so forth. So they had this basis that, the United States was the moniker of protecting democracy and republicanism. And so when the Civil War erupts, it's a major deal. Like, these monarchists and other anti-republic people did not want America to succeed, but yet, based off of the correspondence and so forth, they would do so. Now, if you break it down, so for many years into this war, the Confederate States had seemed to have an insight and a likelihood of being recognized, which being recognized at this time means you have a diplomatic court, you may be allied or have a defense pact or trade, some things that the Union did not want the Confederates to have because the Confederates were being, they were being blockaded by the Union. The Union was doing what they were called the Anaconda Plan by Winfield Scott, General Winfield Scott, later not McClellan, but the people in charge of the Navy, Gustav V. Fox. And so, they didn't want recognition, but the Confederates had a very close alliance, or at least recognition, because there are a few events that happened. Like I said, Victoria doesn't like the United States, but also you had an event called the Trent Affair, which is essentially about traveling to Europe. Had diplomats from the Confederate States of America. Some people from the Union came in and arrested them, in the proximity of the British ship. That was a major issue, that you don't do that, especially not to the British Empire, because it makes you look weak. It got really close to the British government under Lord Palmerston to recognize them. But eventually, at the end of the day, it didn't happen because cooler hands prevailed. And ironically enough, despite the Liverpool and Manchester textile mills and other places, people were losing their jobs. So unemployment was very high because of the lack of cotton from the South. But yet, the working class of the British people, according to Doyle's book, talks about how they openly supported the Union. They were very pro-Union because they saw the Republican themes that they would like in the United Kingdom. Remember, the United Kingdom did not allow most males to vote for a very long time. And so there's a connection there. And individuals like Gladstone, who would become prime minister off and on, they will use some of the ideas that are fought over in the Civil War in order to reform their system. Not to mention you have issues like the Corn Laws. Food was being tariffed, so the poorest people are paying tariffs on basic food stuff, and that was not good. So you have a lot of the liberal government. What is it? I don't think it was called Labor back then, but Gladstone's party would, they would rise in the aftermath of the Civil War, because you had Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, were kind of competing, sort of, like, for how they're framing the British Empire. And a very interesting history one should look into if they're a serious student of said time period. But, so because of the Trent Affair and other issues, according to Doyle, the South got very close to getting recognition. At the end of the day, it didn't happen because of the British working class being against this situation. And even though they lost their jobs, they stood on principle. Big deal. The French, on the other hand, had a very interesting dynamic with the Confederates, and it's very interesting development, because the idea is you had Franz Joseph, who is the leader of Austria, the Habsburgs. He has a brother, I believe. I believe it's his brother or stepbrother, something like that. He's an important guy. He controls Lombardy, I believe it is. And this guy named Maximilian. Sorry, Maximilian's the one who controls Lombardy. He did an okay job. He's annoying the heck out of Franz Joseph, though, who will live a long time. And so they decide, well, let's get rid of him by sending him to Mexico. That's basically what the book claims and ideas, And then so the French invade Mexico because the Union's busy. They can't really enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And so in Mexico, you have Benito Juarez. He's the first indigenous leader of that country, or mixed, or indigenous. Depends on how you view it. But yeah, he's more of a common man. They fought wars in order to get rid of the Catholic Church control in Mexico at this time, early 1860s. So, Maximilian and his troops come in. They invade in the Battle of Pueblo, and they were stopped. 1862, I think it was. So Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, they were stopped. France kind of reconnects. They try to put it back together because Napoleon III basically thought that they were going to waltz in there and take it, and that was not the case. So that's going on, and so Cinco de Mayo celebrated, in this Puebla today, even. But yeah, they stopped the French temporarily. They had to retreat. They did another invasion later. While this is going on, by the way, Benito Juarez, he does not like slavery. Slavery was abolished in Mexico. I believe it was 1829. That's part of the reason why Texas has its revolution, is because the Texas estate owners, hacienda owners, they wanted their slaves. It's profitable cotton. Okay. Now, what's interesting though is Benito Juarez. He has these border areas where he's processing and tariffing cotton because they need cotton. Well, in Coahuila, in one of the cities there, they were basically responsible for clothing all the slaves in Texas throughout the war. And so Benito Juarez, he's making a lot of money off of tariffing this cotton that's going in. And this is very interesting. And so, I don't remember what the town is. Let me see real quick. Saltillo, sorry. They're a major cotton producer too. They're getting tariffs and so forth. They're making large sheets for people to wear. I mean, this is real bare bone clothing. This is going on. Benito Juarez is getting funded to fight the French and his own domestic issues at this time. You have warlords in the northern Mexico, because if you know anything about Mexico, there's two giant mountain ranges, and what are they? The Sierra Occidental and the Sierra Occidental. They're huge. They're massive ranges. Okay, so Mexico's very divided in the north, and so this is going on. Juarez is in trouble. He ends up, I think, crossing the border back into Texas during the war, because he's almost captured basically. And while this is going on, the Confederates are like, "Oh yeah, Napoleon, you can do whatever you want," because Napoleon III's idea is he wants a Latin empire. He wants to control from Mexico all the way to Argentina at some point, or have some sort of arrangement where they split it up with a few monarchs. He wants to control all that territory. He thinks that the people there are barbaric, and so he thinks he's just gonna have his, friend there, Maximilian, go in there and take care of things. Maximilian eventually does succeed, taking over Mexico. He becomes Emperor of Mexico for a few years. I think it was 1867, I believe. Well, anyways, yeah, he stays in there for a little bit. Let me check, just to make sure. (1864 to 1867). Sorry, I got it confused. Yeah, so they eventually take it. He's got his wife there. Maximilian's got his wife there. Eventually, Benito Juarez and his allies, they defeat Maximilian, and I think Juarez did not want to execute Maximilian, but the people, like I said, they just had civil wars. They decided to kill him, and he's not gonna stand in their way because he doesn't want more issues. And so they kill him, and Napoleon is set back quite a bit. And then 3 years later, Franco-Prussian War. So that was kind of when Maximilian dies. That's kind of like the shattering of the dreams of the French at this time. And so, but yeah, while this is going, I mean, the Confederates got so desperate for French help. They wanted the French Navy to come assist them, that they were promising, if you want to take over all of Mexico, we'll do all this trade with you. And at some point, they were even arguing, well, we'd rather be under a monarchy than under the Union, as long as we have slavery. I mean, this is how crazy, in the book it talks about how it gets. And, I mean, just wild stuff. Like, it's unbelievable that the Confederates, which claim they care about states' rights and they're against the tariff of abomination, as they call them, the moral tariffs, I think, they're at the point where they want monarchy by the end of the Civil War. So it's phenomenal, crazy stuff. But yeah, so this is all documented in Doyle's book, and there's a lot of really great sources at the end, but I'm trying not to give the entire book away, but yeah. So, let's see, what other issues to deal with? Yes, another major thing talked about in the book is that there are a lot of foreigners who get involved in this conflict. I think at least a third of the Union Army is either, directly immigrated to the United States within, the last 10 years. Or, I think it's even more if you count first children of immigrants. So this conflict is fought by people who are fresh to the country. And it's really remarkable because you think about it. With the 1850s, what do you have? The Irish potato famines. You have that, and what do? They come over to the U.S., and Irish disproportionately fight in the Civil War. They're one of the largest ethnic groups, if not the largest. So the Italians, they all come over by Garibaldi's prodding and so forth. And a lot of different groups, the Germans, they all fight for this common cause because they don't want to see America, the United States, become like Europe. They left there for a reason. Now, back to the Italy and Garibaldi, while the British and the French had been working to leave, not leave, but to endorse the Confederate States of America, Garibaldi makes his move, and he actually distracts these powers from getting involved because there were a lot of battles in which the Union lost, and it was not looking good. You had the first Battle of Bull Run. You had all sorts of issues. Grant's starting to have some success in 1862, but I mean, eventually you get Antietam, which is an important battle, but I mean, it's not looking good. The military situation for the Union's not looking good. McClellan's trying to do his Peninsular campaign, trying to go for Richmond, and he gets destroyed. I mean, he had a lot more troops, but he was too fidget, and then eventually Robert E. Lee comes about, takes him. I think Longstreet might have been the general at the time. Longstreet was kind of losing, but then Lee came in and took over and defeated McClellan. This is one of the reasons I think McClellan gets removed from his commander of the Union armies, and eventually he runs against Lincoln in 1864 because he thought he got railroaded, which, based off the evidence, this was not true. But so these are major aspects. So Garibaldi keeps assisting, even though he's not leading troops. He keeps influencing in a positive way in Europe. Okay. So yeah, you have a lot of different immigrant soldiers from here, and it's very important. And quite frankly, similar to the African American United States colored troops, which was around 100,000, you most likely wouldn't have won the war if you didn't have immigrants serving in the Union. By the way, not many came to the Confederate States of America. Those were more people who had been born there. And considering, I think, what is it, 3-4% of people own slaves in the South, it's kind of understandable why they would not have as much popular support. In fact, I think by the end of the war, they were trying to conscript African Americans to fight for the Confederacy. So, yeah, they had a manpower shortage for a reason. But, yeah. Okay. So, let's see. Now, the Union, for the actual diplomats, the Union tried and effectively influenced the courts of these European countries. They had people who spoke different languages. They had people who understood the way. Whereas in the South, they were more reliant on people who, quite frankly, had never left the United States, nor had any sort of control. There were some exceptions. People like, John Slidell, I think he spoke French, and that was interesting. Henry Hotz, you had priests in both states who were Interesting enough, Pope Pius IX himself actually supported the Confederacy secretly. There was correspondence between the Pope and the Confederate leadership, which is crazy if you think about it. I mean, it kind of gives Garibaldi some credence towards his idea of the corruption of the church, but that's a huge topic. But yeah, so you had a lot of different elements there. It's just ridiculous. But eventually things will turn. One thing from page 233 that I thought was interesting. In October 1862, Judah P. Benjamin was dismayed to learn that the French were making overtures to the Governor Franz Lubbock of Texas by the way of encouraging his state to break away from the Confederacy. So, Texas is not entirely on board at this point. That's really bad for the Confederacy. So, there's a lot of production of agriculture and different things in Texas. If that goes, that's a big issue for the Confederacy. Okay. Let's see. So, yeah, in page 253, in early August 1863, the exasperated Secretary of State of the Confederacy shut down the mission of Britain. So by 1863, late 1863, the Battle of Antietam and different things, the Confederates stopped trying in the United Kingdom. Really, their only hope, frankly, with the supporters was to get either of the French or the British to assist them. Since they didn't succeed in that, they were done, supply-wise and so forth. But, yeah, crazy stuff. Then what do you have? You have, later on, by the end of the war, you also have issues with, changes of government. So, like in Spain, which I should have talked about more, but I'll talk about now. Spain actually invaded the Dominican Republic during this time period and tried to, expand slavery, try to expand territory, but because of that failed, the guerrilla warfare of the Dominican Republic, the people were too skilled, too good. Eventually, they stop in April of 1865, but eventually, Queen Isabel II, who's the queen then, she gets overthrown by revolutionaries, by General Juan Prim in 1868. So, Prim was not happy. He was a Spanish general. He basically overthrew her because of ineptitude. So, yeah. Also, after this, Doyle suggests that in page 301 that other countries took, the end of the Civil War as a cue to end their slavery. Cuba and Brazil have slavery at this point, just to be clear. So, in 1871, Brazil passed the Rio Branco Law, which freed all children born to slave women. Eventually, in 1888, Brazil passes the Golden Law that abolishes slavery. This was done under the monarch there, Pedro II, who was actually fairly open-minded for a monarch at that time. And so you have to think, well, the Civil War obviously influenced this. Yeah, so, I mean, you have a lot of things going on down here. Eventually, it talks about, like, later on the aftermath of the war, page 306, Jefferson Davis languished in a prison for 2 years. The Russians, offer Alaska up in 1868, 67. Tsar, what was it, Alexander II, he emancipates the serfs, and he also sells Alaska. So a lot of big things happen because of the Union victory. And later on, and the book ends, and I think this is very timely too, was that Bartholdi starts working on the Statue of Liberty. And he, plans this. He comes to America in 1865. He comes up with some of it in 1876. He has the Hannah torch that's ready for the centennial. But eventually, the actual Statue of Liberty would be done in 1886. And I thought that was a really good way of celebrating the end of the Civil War and the freedoms that would last and impact other cultures. But yeah, so all in all, this book approaches a lot of very good themes. But The Cause of All Nations by Doyle, it's not as recognized as it probably should be, but I think considering how there is a historiographical and people, let me put it plainly, people recognize that, like, the American Revolution was not just about America. The 7 Years' War was not about America only. It was a whole world conflict, Atlantic conflict. The Civil War really isn't that much different. There was less involvement directly by parties, but there was money, there was all sorts of things going on in Europe, and this affected North America, and eventually the Canadians, 1867, they would become, they would join Upper and Lower Canada, and Mexico, they get rid of Maximilian. So it really isn't just a domestic thing, a domestic conflict, and I hope that for all interested, you get this book at your library or off Amazon. It's not very expensive. It's from 2015. The Cause of All Nations by Don H. Doyle. I recommend it. Very good book. If you care about, like, the